Hey, it's Watch Complications. I'm Brian. This is my first video in 2021 and I hope you enjoy it. We're going to be doing a chat with Brian, so not a crazy long video, and we're going to talk about something very specific. I want to start with just a couple quick notes. First, congratulations to Eric G. He won the G-Shock giveaway, and I'll post pictures in the community page and on my social media as soon as he receives the watch and is able to send me a picture of it. So congratulations, Eric. For those who didn't win the G-Shock, thank you for your feedback in terms of what types of videos you will like to see. Of course, I take all that into consideration and I'll continue to try to get out as many videos as possible given all the other constraints of life. Also want to give a quick shout out to Dave from the Christopher Ward Enthusiast Facebook group for the computer art, the desktop background that he shared with the group not that long ago. That's the Make 3 Trident hands. Beautiful picture. Love having it as a background. Just thanks. Awesome for sharing it. I wasn't necessarily planning on doing this video next. I was hoping to do the introduction to Watchy Pro, which Ansi and I released back in December, and I want to give sort of an overview of all the features and all the cool stuff in Watchy Pro. So I'll have that in the next video, and I'll go ahead and put links below if you want to go check it out before then, but that's coming soon as well. So I'm assuming you've already seen the title of the video, so you know what we're going to be talking about. That's the most abused complication, and you might have a giveaway for that by looking at my shirt. It is the date. So as we get into this chat with Brian, which is going to be kind of interesting to talk through, I'm going to show lots of pictures of different implementations of the date complication, of course. But two very specific things. One, by abused, I don't mean useless, okay? The date is a very useful complication, particularly if you're the type of person who's needing to regularly look at your watch through a day and needing to remind yourself whether you're signing documents a lot, etc., etc. It's not that it's a useless complication. That's not what I mean by abused, okay? I mean more of a misused or a misimplemented or an overdone sort of complication. Let me give you an illustration what I mean by abused, misused versus, useful, uselessness. So, for example, moon phase. Most people would say pretty useless. Probably, I've heard the most on forums and stuff, the most useless complication that might be out there. And I gotta tend to agree it's not that useful of a complication. However, it's not necessarily abused, meaning it's not overused, it's not overdone. Whenever it is implemented, it's usually done so in a very tasteful way. So that's usually at 12 o'clock with a big moon phase, or maybe at 6 o'clock with a smaller one. Sometimes on calendar watches, it has its own little space, does everything else with a pretty full dial. So moon phase isn't abused, but it's not the most useful of things. Date's particularly useful, but it's just overdone and misused in just so many ways, particularly when it comes to overall dial face design. So let's give some context to the complication itself. I've done a previous video on how the complication works under the hood. I'll link that in the video above and in the description below. So take a look at that if you want to see how the date wheel and mechanisms work under the hood. Now, beyond normal just time telling, the date complication is going to be the most common complication you come across in the world of watches, obviously. And it's been around the longest in terms of complications. So I want to give a little bit of a history and background on the complication itself, and then we'll get into the pros and the cons of the way it's done. So in terms of the history of the date complication, I hope this year in 2021 to get to some of my pocket watches and restoration work around those. But of course, pocket watches existed before wristwatches. So in the late 19th and early 20th century, so late 1800s, early 1900s, the date complication started working its way into pocket watches. And just like the variety of implementations for the date complication that we have in modern watches, the same is true regarding pocket watches of that era. Probably the most common one I've seen in pocket watches is some variant of the pointer date. But there were also complete calendars with the date, with the day, with the month of the year, moon phase, right? All these things about telling time. It's worth noting that in the early days of the date complication, it was something that had to be set manually quite often. So you had to remember to flip that date forward when you got up in the morning and set the time to your watch, or if it was already out of a charge, you recharge it and then set the date. So you already had to reference the paper or whatever, or like today, when you've set it in the watch box, you go pick it up, you need to check the date on your phone and the time on your phone so you can set that automatic or mechanical watch. There's an inherent advantage to quartz, even though it's not as interesting. There are a couple other ways the date complication is set. There's a quick set feature so it can flip the date. Some watches you have to take the 24-hour hand all the way around to flip the date. Some can go forward only. Some can go both forward and backwards. So there's all kinds of mechanical ways that the date is handled. Just look at the information on your watch to know how to set it. And if you want more information on those mechanical workings, check out the video on the date complication linked in the video. Around the turn of the century, the date complication is finding its way into pocket watches, and then about 1915, a maker by the name of Hammerly introduces it to the world of wristwatches. Now that junction is important. You have World War I in play, you have the date complication that's already existed in pocket watches, and now you have people who are taking old pocket watches and making wristwatches out of them, wiring lugs to them and whatnot, the birth of the trench watch. And from that junction then, the evolution continues of that date complication evolving on the wrist as opposed to evolving in the pocket. The next big step's about 1930 with Mimo, and they patented and released the first date window in a watch with the Mimo meter. This sort of brought the complication to the masses. It wasn't just for higher end horology, the people that could afford the fancier watches that had that complication. Now when most enthusiasts think of date complication history, their mind's probably going to go to Rolex first. That wasn't until about 1945 when Hans Wilsdorf, the founder of Rolex, introduced what they called the Datejust, the first automatic watch with a date window and a date wheel around 1945. I will come back to the notion of the Cyclops. Those of you who've seen maybe some of my earlier videos know how I feel about it already, but that's one of those egregious abuses of the date complication in my estimation. So let's talk about some of the ways that the date is done when it comes to more modern watches. First is really the pointer date, because that's where it started. So it had a lot of popularity through the mid-20th century, still pretty common. A variety of brands use this mechanism. Oris is a fairly popular version of this. Other horological brands do this as well, where you have an additional hand that points to a corresponding date number printed somewhere on the dial. Then we have what I'm going to call the standard date, and that is the date window at 3 o'clock. Sometimes it's accompanied by a day, the day-date complication, but this is the most common way you'll see a date done on a watch face. And this is where the abuse really comes into play. There are so many watches out there, good watches, that would look so much better. They would be more user-friendly, from both reading the watch to looking at the watch to symmetry. Just everything would be balanced better if the date wasn't there or it was put in a different location that was smarter. There's so many watches I've been interested in buying before, but I didn't for one reason. The date is just off-putting. It throws the whole balance of the dial face off. This is the most misused aspect of the date complication, and I find it annoying many times. My opinion. And yes, I say that it's not necessary. Just think for a moment, for the majority of people, if you are a person who needs to date regularly through a week, through a month, completely understand. It's cool if you love your date on the watch face. But I would argue, for the majority of people, it's just not that needed, where it needs to be right on the dial face, particularly in an asymmetrical or amplified position for the overall look. Think about sitting down at your desk at work. If you need the date, you've got your phone, which most modern phones, whether that's your cell phone, it's your work phone on the desk that has, the date and the caller ID and the time and, voicemail and all that stuff, whether it's cell phone, desk phone, date's there. Maybe it's in a calendar on the wall. Maybe it's a pad on the desk. Date is everywhere, just like time's everywhere. So I'm not saying that's necessarily a great argument or the only argument, but for most people, you don't need to go looking for the date that often, and when you do, it's readily available everywhere else around you as well. Why throw off wonderful looking designs at 3, 4:30, or other odd positions you often find for the date? I just don't get it. So why continue to mass produce watches with these asymmetric dials? Because it's just the way we've been doing it. It's the way that makers and companies have continue to do it and just won't get rid of it when they really don't need it. I really wish more companies would take that path with more of their designs instead of throwing it into places where it just makes no sense, i.e. the 430 position, when everything else on a dial is symmetrical. And there are companies where I love their designs, I love their watches for the most part. But then a model will come up like, why? Why was that choice made? Especially when there are ways to do it better. If you want a date, need a date. If you're a maker or a brand and you want to design a watch that has a date, why not take one of the other paths available to you that looks better? And if you are going to have a date at 3, there are some other things that can be done to help balance it out. You could put some text at 9 o'clock, though not many companies do that. They could, for example, move the depth rating information there, and at least it would bring some symmetry and balance to the dial. I'm a fan of Christopher Ward, that's no secret. Not everybody is, but I think they offer good value for the money. And you know what? The logo movement from 12 to 9 was a big ordeal. People still rant and talk about it. But you know what? On the watches I have that have a date in more modern Christopher Wards, that text at 9 helps balance out that date window, which I can actually appreciate a little bit. So let's shift that 3 o'clock window to 6 o'clock. Makes a world of difference on making a watch look good. 3 of my watches, and I like them a little bit more than some of the others because of that date. Just the date, not just the overall design, because that date is in the right spot, or a right spot, that doesn't throw off dial symmetry. You can imagine how it does. I really love Grand Seiko. It looks a little okay on the spring drive, for example, because you got something sitting on the left side of the dial to help balance out the right side of the dial. But there are some just wonderful GS designs that, again, I would buy in a heartbeat, but why is that date there? There are many, many more models that have the date, and only a handful that don't. And I just don't understand that. It's a big lopsided imbalance between designs that have a date and the designs that don't. And I know which side I prefer. What that makes it hard to do is, though, find designs of watches that are balanced and that you really like because of that singular complication. And I think some models could be a lot more popular if they didn't, if they had that symmetrical look about them. Now, when that date gets shifted from 3 to 6, it also gives you a symmetrical opportunity to put the day of the week, the day at 12 o'clock. Rolex got that right. It's a design I particularly like. I have one watch that has that layout. So you have the day of the week at 12, and then you have the date at 6. It's a particularly good look if you are one of those people that wants to have a day-date complication. There's another option, and that is the big date. I like to call it the grand date. Vacheron Constantin has that. This is in the Royal Eagle. Again, the more modern overseas models, for example, I think they look great, particularly the blue. It's spectacular. But again, it would look so much better if it didn't have the date at 3, and I just don't know why. I'd like to do a survey at some point. I don't want to speculate. I don't know if companies do that particular kind of research around the models, or if they just sit in their design meetings and say, well, we've got the movement, we've always done it this way, we're just going to keep it there. But I would love to see more surveys or work done around, if we produce this model, here it is with a date, here it is without a date, how many of you would buy this model, how many of you would buy that model? And might be surprised that there's probably been a shift. There might be a more natural tendency to move away from the date complication over time as it's become part of just the world around us, where we kind of see it everywhere. It's kind of known all the time, etc. Now, as a watch enthusiast, you know what I really like? A watch with no date. I change my watches almost daily, and so if a watch, I get up, I set it, I wear it for the day. You get up, you set the date, or if it's a day date, you go through all of that. It's a GMT, right? You go through this trouble, you set up everything, and then you wear it for a day or two, perhaps, and then it's on the shelf and you wear something else. Now, that's personal preference. You could wear the singular watch all the time, or wear them for a week at a time or a month at a time. Lots of people do that different ways. So, you know, it is what it is. But if I want to change them out regularly, that's something extra you have to set every time you put it on the wrist. Again, that's sort of one of those things where it's just, it's been overdone, and when it's not necessary, and it's just more of an inconvenience when it comes to setting the watch if you change them out a lot. So A lot of times people may not even mess with changing the date. And I know some of you are out there. You're not changing the date. You don't set the date. You just set the time and go. What I really like as an enthusiast that changes my watches pretty regularly on the wrist is no date. 3 of my favorite and most worn watches are just that, just so I can pick them up and go. Pick them up, set the time, that's it, go. No frills, no fluff. The Rolex 114-300, dark rhodium, beautiful, simple. Throw a date on that, sure, like the date just ugly. There's my Vario, just simple. 20 twists of the thing, set the time, run out the door. It's beautiful simplicity. I have my Marlowe Moror, probably one of the most worn watches, and my most worn watch of 2020. And just that's the reason why. Just simple, 3-hand watch, pick it up, set the time, and go. No date, just a good old time-telling watch. Now to the Cyclops, which of course was started as a Rolex thing, and now all the homage watches and all these other companies and stuff do it as well. The weirdest thing is seeing a Cyclops on a day date. I know some of you may have seen that. Google that sometime. It's kind of weird. Or sometimes you'll see a Cyclops on the date at 6. That's even weirder looking. But people have been kind of trained, particularly in that sports space, to see this monocle on a watch. That's what I like to call it. It's just a monocle on a watch. This little dome that sticks out above the surface. It's glued on. It amplifies the date. Again, modern times, people. I can't see a thing without my glasses. So you know what I have? I have glasses. And I can see a date at wrist length on my Pagani, which had a Cyclops initially. I can see that date at arm's length, further than arm's length, with a good old pair of glasses. I don't need magnification on mine. Some people might need that. As you get older, eyes start to go a little bit, but again, glasses. But, you know, some people like to be able to see it larger, but the thing is, I find that Cyclops lenses obscure. If you're at an angle of any sort, as opposed to just straight on, a little bit hard to make out the date. It's actually easier to make it out if there wasn't a lens in the way. So the Cyclops is just one of these watch pet peeves of mine, personally. Again, just my opinion. I love my Pagani design. I did some modding on it in earlier videos. I'll link those as well. But I swapped the seconds hand, I realigned the bezel, but I also removed the Cyclops lens. It looks better. The Cyclops, as far as I'm concerned, just amplifies an already abused complication. And again, so many watches would look better without that lens, and it would look even better without the date. I'm just telling you the truth. You don't have to agree, but I'm right. So as we sort of end this chat with Brian today, what complication is the most misused, overdone, abused complication? The date. I think we should all try to do our best to steer the world, the watch world, in a better direction, an enlightened direction that's really gives an emphasis to well done design, symmetrical design when possible, even if it's not perfect. Of course, this has all just been my opinion. I'm sure you have your own. Share your thoughts in the comments below. You know, dates are okay. I have plenty of watches with them, as you can see through some of the pictures today. So I have no shortage of dates, but still, I would take most watches without it if it was possible. So next time you're thinking about a purchase, consider going for that watch without a Cyclops. Go for the watch without a date, or has a date at 6 or 12 instead of in that ugly location at 3 o'clock, please. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our chat about the date complication. Check out my website, watchcomplications.com. Quick hint, it's getting a facelift in the coming months. You're going to see an entirely new scheme and layout to watchcomplications.com. Follow me here, subscribe, hit the bell if you want updates, and check out my Instagram at watch_complications. I'm Brian. I am out.